The Sun's Wrath. Chapter 1. The Storm Approaches. The year was 2049, and humanity had reached unprecedented heights. Technology governed every aspect of life. From self-driving cars to intelligent cities that managed resources with near-perfect efficiency, people had grown accustomed to a life of ease. They communicated instantly across the globe, enjoyed entertainment from virtual realities, and even prolonged their lives through advanced medical procedures. But all of this was about to change. The warning came from a team of astronomers based at the Sunwatch Observatory in the Andes. Dr. Elena Morales, the head of the observatory, was the first to notice the unusual solar activity. It started as a series of intense sunspots, which quickly grew in number and size. The solar flares that erupted were like nothing ever recorded. The magnetic energy building up on the sun's surface was staggering. The sun's been quiet for decades, but now it's waking up with a vengeance, Dr. Morales murmured, staring at the data with growing dread. The models predicted a massive coronal mass ejection, CME, aimed directly at Earth. This was no ordinary solar storm. It was a once-in-a-thousand-years event. The news spread quickly among the scientific community. Discussions were held at the highest levels of government, but the general public was kept in the dark to avoid mass panic. Preparations were made to shut down power grids and secure essential systems. But there was only so much that could be done. On the morning of July 16th, the CME hit. Chapter 2. The day the lights went out. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. Power stations worldwide overloaded and shut down, plunging cities into darkness. Satellites orbiting the Earth were fried by the intense radiation, severing all forms of global communication. Planes fell from the sky as their electronic systems failed, and the stock markets, automated and online, ceased to function. The modern world, so intricately tied to technology, ground to a halt. In New York, business tycoon Robert Kane watched in horror as the lights in his skyscraper office flickered out. His phone was dead, as were the computers and the city below. Outside, the normally bustling streets were filled with chaos. People rushed to escape the city, but the highways were jammed with cars that had suddenly become useless hunks of metal. Across the globe, a similar scene played out. From Tokyo to London to Moscow, people found themselves thrust into a world they were unprepared for. Those in rural areas fared slightly better, but even they faced the collapse of the infrastructure that supported modern life. In a matter of hours, the world was thrown back centuries. The most technologically advanced civilization in history was suddenly as helpless as the early settlers, struggling to find food, water, and shelter. Chapter 3. The New Reality. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of the situation set in. Without electricity, food preservation became impossible. Supermarkets were looted within days, and those who had been reliant on modern conveniences quickly found themselves desperate. In rural Montana, a small community, led by Sarah Caldwell, a former farmer, began to adapt. With no power, they turned to old farming techniques, relying on hand tools and animal labor to grow crops. Sarah's knowledge of traditional farming methods became invaluable. She taught her neighbors how to rotate crops, preserve food through canning, and hunt for game. But it wasn't just rural communities that began to adapt. In cities, groups formed to scavenge for resources and protect themselves from the increasingly desperate population. Law and order broke down, and those with survival skills became leaders in this new, primitive society. In the outskirts of Los Angeles, a group of former tech employees formed a commune. They used what little they had to create a sustainable community, growing their own food and purifying water. Though they were unprepared at first, they quickly learned the skills needed to survive. But with resources dwindling, the city became a dangerous place. Gangs roamed the streets, and people fought over the last remnants of the old world. The rich and powerful, once at the top of society, found themselves just as helpless as everyone else. Without their wealth and technology to support them, they had to learn to fend for themselves or rely on the kindness of others. Chapter 4. Hope amidst the ruins. As the months passed, pockets of civilization began to stabilize. Small communities like the one led by Sarah Caldwell started to thrive. They traded with neighboring communities, exchanging goods and knowledge. The old world was gone, but a new one was slowly emerging. In the Appalachian Mountains, a group of survivors discovered an old hydroelectric dam that could be manually operated. With hard work, they managed to restore limited power to their community. It was a small victory, but it symbolized the resilience of the human spirit. Dr. Elena Morales, who had survived the initial chaos, worked tirelessly to reconnect with other scientists around the world. Using old shortwave radios, she managed to establish communication with other observatories. Together, they began to study the sun's activity, trying to predict when the next storm might occur. They also worked on creating new technologies that didn't rely on electricity, hoping to rebuild society in a more sustainable way. In Europe, a group of engineers and architects came together to design new types of buildings that could withstand the extreme weather conditions brought on by the solar storm. These buildings were constructed using local materials and designed to be self-sufficient, harnessing wind and water power instead of electricity. Chapter 5. A New Dawn. 5 years after the storm, the world was a very different place. The global population had shrunk significantly due to famine, disease, and violence. But those who survived were stronger and more self-reliant. They had learned to live without the conveniences of modern technology, relying on each other and the resources around them. The communities that had formed were connected by a network of messengers who traveled on horseback, carrying news and goods between settlements. Trade routes developed, and a new economy based on barter and mutual aid took shape. In the ruins of the old cities, people began to reclaim the land, turning abandoned skyscrapers into vertical farms and using the rubble to build new homes. The technology that had once defined humanity was slowly being replaced by a new form of ingenuity, one that valued sustainability and community over convenience. Dr. Elena Morales and her fellow scientists continued their work, now with a clear understanding that the sun was both a giver and a taker of life. They developed new ways to monitor solar activity and educate the survivors about the dangers that still lurked in the skies. As the world slowly rebuilt itself, the memory of the old world faded. The lessons learned from the solar storm became the foundation for a new society, one that was more in harmony with the natural world. In the end, humanity had been given a second chance. The sun's wrath had been a harsh teacher, but it had also forced people to rediscover what it meant to truly live. Chapter 6. The Fragile Peace. The 6th year after the storm began with an uneasy calm. Communities had settled into a fragile routine, but the memory of the chaos was still fresh. In the Appalachian settlement, now known as New Hope, the small hydroelectric power station provided the community with limited electricity, enough to power a few essential tools and maintain basic communication. The people of New Hope prided themselves on their resilience, but they also knew that their survival depended on the goodwill and cooperation of neighboring communities. Sarah Caldwell, now a recognized leader in her region, organized a yearly gathering of representatives from nearby settlements. They met to discuss trade, security, and mutual aid. The gathering, held in what remained of an old university lecture hall, was a symbol of the New World's attempts to build a collective future. This year, the agenda was more urgent than ever. Reports of raiding parties from the cities had increased, and food supplies were threatened by unpredictable weather patterns. Among the attendees was a man named Marcus Valeni, who had once been a high-ranking official in the old government. Now, he led a small but well-organized settlement called Riverside. His community had access to a river rich in fish, which had become a valuable trade resource. However, Marcus had a vision beyond mere survival. He believed that humanity needed to reclaim the technology of the past and restore the world to its former glory. During the gathering, Marcus proposed a bold plan: to journey to the ruins of Washington, D.C., where remnants of the old government might still be preserved. He had heard rumors of an underground facility that housed advanced technologies and archives from before the storm. If they could access these resources, Marcus argued, they could begin rebuilding the world in earnest. Sarah was skeptical. The journey would be perilous, and she questioned whether it was worth the risk. "We've learned to live without the old world's technology," she said. Maybe it's time to let it go and focus on building something new, something better. But Marcus was persuasive. He appealed to the fear that still lingered in everyone's hearts, the fear that another storm could come, one that they would not survive without advanced knowledge and tools. After much debate, it was decided that a small group would undertake the expedition, with Marcus leading the way. Chapter 7. The Expedition. The expedition to Washington, D.C. began in early spring. The group consisted of Marcus, Sarah, a young engineer named Elena who had apprenticed under Dr. Morales, and 2 seasoned hunters from New Hope. They traveled by foot and horseback, following old highways that were now overgrown with vegetation and littered with the rusting hulks of abandoned vehicles. The journey was long and fraught with danger. They encountered other survivors, some of whom were hostile, while others offered help. In one particularly harrowing episode, they were ambushed by a gang of raiders near what was once Baltimore. The raiders, desperate and brutal, saw the expedition as easy prey. But the group managed to fight them off, though not without sustaining injuries. As they drew closer to Washington, the landscape became more desolate. The city had been one of the hardest hit during the storm. The EMP blast had fried every electronic system, and the chaos that followed had decimated the population. Buildings that had once been symbols of power and governance now stood in ruins, overtaken by nature. Finally, they reached the outskirts of the capital. Marcus led them to the coordinates he had obtained, rumored to be the location of the underground facility. After days of searching through the rubble, they found it, a hidden entrance buried beneath what had once been a government office. The facility was intact, its entrance sealed off from the world above. Inside, they found rows of computer terminals, servers, and shelves filled with documents. But the most astonishing discovery was a small, self-contained nuclear reactor that had somehow survived the storm's effects. Elena, the engineer, was able to bring the facility's systems online, and the group was stunned to find that much of the data was still accessible. There were archives on renewable energy, advanced medical treatments, and blueprints for sustainable cities, knowledge that could potentially reshape their world. But as they delved deeper, they uncovered something more troubling. Among the files was a report, dated just days before the storm, detailing experiments with solar energy that had gone terribly wrong. It suggested that the unprecedented solar activity might not have been entirely natural, that human actions could have exacerbated the sun's instability. Chapter 8. Secrets of the Past. The discovery left the group reeling. If true, it meant that the solar storm was not just a natural disaster, but partially a man-made catastrophe. Marcus saw this information as a potential tool. If the public knew the truth, they might support a return to centralized authority and advanced technology to prevent such a disaster from happening again. But Sarah was more cautious. She feared that revealing the truth could lead to more division and conflict. She also worried about what would happen if the technology in the facility fell into the wrong hands. The knowledge they had found could be used for good, but it could just as easily be used to re-establish the power structures that had led to the downfall of the old world. The group decided to stay in the facility for a few weeks, gathering as much information as possible. Elena worked tirelessly to copy the most important files, while the others explored the deeper sections of the facility. They found weapons, supplies, and even a small stockpile of experimental drones designed for surveillance and defense. As they prepared to leave, Marcus made a proposal. "We can't let this knowledge die here," he said. "We should return to New Hope and use it to rebuild. But we need to be careful. If we're going to use this power, it has to be for the right reasons." Sarah agreed, but she remained wary. "Knowledge is a double-edged sword, Marcus. We have to be sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past." Chapter 9. Return to New Hope. The journey back to New Hope was quicker, but not without its challenges. The group was weighed down by the equipment and data they had retrieved, making them slower and more vulnerable. However, the knowledge of what they carried motivated them to press on. When they finally returned, they were met with a mix of relief and curiosity. The community had managed well in their absence, but everyone was eager to hear about what they had found. A council meeting was called, and Marcus and Sarah presented their findings. The reaction was mixed. Some were excited by the prospect of using the old technology to improve their lives, while others were fearful of the potential consequences. The revelation that human actions might have played a role in the solar storm caused particular unease. It led to heated debates about responsibility, ethics, and the future of their society. Elena proposed a cautious approach. She suggested setting up a small research group to study the technology and gradually introduce improvements to their daily lives. This would allow them to benefit from the old world's knowledge without becoming dependent on it again. The community agreed, and the research group was formed, with Elena as its leader. They began by improving agricultural techniques and water purification systems, using the data they had recovered. Slowly, life in New Hope became a bit easier, but the specter of the old world's downfall remained ever present. Chapter 10: A New Threat. As New Hope thrived, word of their success spread to other communities. Some sought to trade and learn from them, while others saw an opportunity to seize what they could not create themselves. One evening, a stranger arrived at New Hope's gates. He claimed to be a messenger from a nearby settlement that had been attacked by a large, well-armed group. The attackers, he said, were not interested in food or supplies. They wanted information, specifically about the technology New Hope had discovered. The council convened immediately. It became clear that their secrets were no longer safe. Marcus, who had been advocating for expanding their influence, now found himself reconsidering his stance. We need to protect ourselves, he argued. If they come for us, we have to be ready. Sarah agreed, but insisted that their response must be measured. We can't let fear drive us. If we become like them, we're no better than the old world we've left behind. They began to fortify their defenses, but they also sent envoys to neighboring communities, offering alliances and mutual protection. Meanwhile, Elena and her team worked on adapting the facility's drones for surveillance, hoping to spot any threats before they reached New Hope. But as tensions rose, an internal conflict began to simmer. Some in the community, especially the younger generation who had never known the old world, grew impatient with the cautious approach. They wanted to embrace the technology fully, to rebuild the world as it once was. They saw Sarah's leadership as too conservative and started to rally around Marcus, whose vision of a more powerful New Hope resonated with them. Chapter 11: The Divide. The growing divide in New Hope came to a head during the next council meeting. The younger faction, led by Marcus, demanded that they take a more aggressive stance in using the technology. They wanted to expand their territory, secure more resources, and establish New Hope as a dominant force in the region. Sarah, backed by the older members and those who remember the chaos after the storm, urged caution. She warned that such actions could lead to more violence and suffering, drawing parallels to the mistakes that had led to the collapse of the old world. The meeting ended in a stalemate, but the tension in the community continued to grow. The once unified group was now split, and it became clear that something had to change. One night, a group of young dissidents attempted to break into the storage facility where the old world's technology was kept. Their plan was to arm themselves and take control of the council by force. But their attempt was thwarted by Elena, who had anticipated such a move. The group was captured, but the incident shook the entire community. Marcus, realizing that his rhetoric had gone too far, tried to calm the situation. He proposed a compromise, a vote on the future direction of New Hope. The community would decide whether to pursue a path of cautious progress or aggressive expansion. The vote was held in the central square, with every member of the community in attendance. The result was close, but in the end, Sarah's vision of cautious progress won out. Marcus accepted the decision, but the divide in the community had left its mark. Chapter 12: The Shadow of the Future. As the months passed, the tension in New Hope began to ease. The younger faction, while disappointed by the vote, gradually came to accept the slower, more deliberate pace of progress. They saw the benefits of the improvements that Elena's team had implemented: better harvests, cleaner water, and more efficient energy use. Yet, the lingering desire for more, for the world that was lost, remained in the background. Sarah continued to lead with a steady hand, focusing on strengthening alliances with neighboring communities and preparing for any external threats. The discovery of the underground facility had changed their world, but she was determined that it would not change the fundamental values that had allowed them to survive and thrive. But the shadow of the past continued to loom over them. The knowledge that humanity's own actions might have contributed to the solar storm weighed heavily on Sarah. She kept this information closely guarded, sharing it only with a select few. The burden of that secret was a heavy one, and she often wondered if she had made the right choice. In the years that followed, New Hope became a beacon for other communities. People came from far and wide to learn from them, to trade, and to share in the new knowledge they had uncovered. The settlement grew, not just in numbers but in influence. They established a network of allied communities, each one self-sufficient but connected by shared values and mutual respect. However, the question of how much of the old world's technology to embrace remained a point of debate. Some argued that they had only scratched the surface of what was possible, while others believed that they should focus on perfecting what they had rather than risking another catastrophe. Chapter 13. The Legacy of the Sun. 10 years after the solar storm, New Hope had become a thriving center of a new civilization. The lessons of the past were never far from their minds, but the people had learned to adapt and rebuild in a way that respected the power of nature and the limits of human ambition. Dr. Elena Morales, who had continued her work in the underground facility, made a discovery that would once again challenge the community. She found evidence that the sun was entering a new phase of activity, one that could potentially lead to another, smaller solar storm within the next few decades. This time, however, they were prepared. Elena had developed new methods of shielding electronic systems and had devised a plan to protect the most critical infrastructure. She also worked with other scientists to develop early warning systems, using the knowledge they had gained from the old world's archives. But with this new knowledge came a decision. Should they warn the world, potentially causing panic, or keep it within their network of communities and prepare quietly? Sarah, now older and wiser, called a council meeting to discuss the matter. The debate was intense, with arguments on both sides. In the end, they decided to share the information with their allies, but to do so in a way that emphasized preparation rather than fear. The legacy of the sun's wrath had taught them many things about the dangers of hubris, the importance of community, and the resilience of the human spirit. As they looked to the future, they knew that they would face more challenges, but they were determined to face them together, guided by the hard-earned lessons of the past.